He was the king of rock and roll, playing to 20,000 screaming fans in Las Vegas, 1976. But when the lights went dark and the crowd roared for an encore, Elvis Presley didn't head for his limousine. Instead, he noticed a single exhausted stagehand slumped by the curtain. What Elvis did next left the man in tears, and the memory still echoes today. Las Vegas Hilton, November 14th, 1976. The marquee lights flickered against the desert night as fans poured into the casino showroom. The room pulsed with energy, nearly 20,000 voices buzzing, waiting, chanting one name, Elvis. Inside, the stage glowed under white-hot spotlights. Rhinestones shimmered on a white jumpsuit as Elvis Presley stepped forward, gripping the microphone. The first notes of C.C. Rider rang out, and the crowd erupted. People leapt from their seats, hands in the air, some clutching ticket stubs like relics. For 2 hours, he gave them everything. Love Me Tender. Suspicious Minds. He moved with a fire that made the Hilton shake, even though close friends whispered that his health was slipping. Sweat rolled down his temples, caught by the soft towel a fan had thrown onto the stage. The audience hung on every gesture, every note, as if the sound itself was stitched into their hearts. Behind the curtain, away from the roar, things looked very different. Crews hustled in shadows, hauling cables, shifting amps, sweating under the same heat that made Elvis's rhinestones shine. One of them, a young stagehand named Danny Rivera, had been on his feet since dawn. He had stacked crates, tightened bolts, run wires no one else would see. His palms were raw, his back ached. Still, the music kept going because people like him never stopped. As Elvis belted out the closing chorus, Danny leaned against a wall. His shirt was damp, his eyes heavy. To the crowd, he was invisible. To most stars, he would always be invisible, but not tonight. When the last chord faded, a storm of applause crashed through the Hilton. It was deafening, like thunder rolling across the desert. Fans screamed for one more song, but in the shadows, a very different moment was about to begin. Elvis stepped down, his boots striking the stage floor with a hollow thud. His guards closed in around him, ready to guide him to safety. That was the routine. That was what always happened. Yet for some reason, he slowed his pace. He looked toward the far corner, toward the boy slumped against the wall, too tired to even notice the king of rock and roll staring right at him. And in that moment, with the crowd still begging for more, Elvis Presley made a choice that no one expected. Because what does it mean to be seen when the world assumes you're invisible? The roar of the Hilton showroom was still shaking the walls. Nearly 20,000 people stamped their feet, clapping, screaming for an encore. The energy was so thick it felt alive, like the room itself was demanding Elvis back on stage. But just beyond the curtain, away from the glare of the lights, a silence formed in Elvis's own steps. Most nights, the king would move swiftly. The guards would close ranks, the door would open, and the star would vanish into his dressing room or glide toward a waiting limousine. That was the pattern, rehearsed and expected. Every second mattered when it came to shielding him from the mob outside. But not tonight. Elvis slowed. His eyes shifted, catching sight of Danny Rivera. The stagehand was half collapsed against a black curtain, sweat streaking his face. His shirt darkened from the day's grind. He didn't even notice Elvis at first. Danny's hands trembled from lifting amps, and his shoulders sagged under invisible weight. The guards urged Elvis forward. "This way, sir." One of them touched his arm. Another glanced nervously toward the stage doors, where the muffled sound of the crowd pressed in like a storm about to break through. They were used to control, to keeping Elvis moving like a tide that couldn't be stopped. But Elvis stopped anyway. He stepped sideways, breaking the rhythm. The room behind the curtain seemed to freeze. Crew members exchanged quick glances, unsure if they should keep working or stand still. Security stiffened. This wasn't in the script. Elvis lowered his gaze and spoke softly, his voice still warm from the stage. "Long night, son." The words fell heavy in the air. Danny blinked in shock, his breath catching. Was Elvis Presley, the Elvis Presley, talking to him? For a moment he couldn't answer. His throat tightened. "Yes, sir," Danny finally whispered, his voice raspy. "Been here since morning," Elvis smiled faintly. He removed the wide rhinestone belt from his waist, the one that had glistened under the lights just moments ago. In the crowd's eyes, it was a trophy, a symbol of his power and style. In that dim backstage corner, it became something else entirely, a reminder that he was human, not untouchable. The guards shifted uneasily. They didn't like breaks in routine. One leaned in, whispering, "We should keep moving." The tension was sharp. Fans were still screaming on the other side of the wall. The Hilton management wanted order, not delay. But Elvis didn't move. He looked Danny straight in the eye. His voice carried both exhaustion and kindness, the weight of years on the road, but also a rare spark of empathy. "You worked harder than anyone out there tonight," Elvis said. "Don't think it went unseen." Danny's chest rose sharply. No one had ever told him that, not once. His job was invisible, his name never spoken, his effort buried behind curtain and concrete. Yet here was the king of rock and roll, breaking through the wall of fame to remind him he mattered. What would you have done in Danny's shoes? Could you even speak back, standing face to face with the most famous man alive? The moment stretched. Every second was defiance. Defiance against schedules, against security, against the machine that told Elvis to keep walking. And in that pause, something fragile and unforgettable began to take shape. The air backstage thickened. Elvis had stopped, and that single act threw the whole machine into hesitation. Security froze, eyes darting. The Hilton's floor manager paced nervously, his clipboard pressed tight to his chest. Everyone knew the crowd outside was still pounding for more. Every second of delay made the tension worse. Danny Rivera stood stiff, unable to believe what was happening. His heartbeat drummed louder than the crowd's echo. He wasn't supposed to be seen. He was just a hand in the dark, a shadow making sure the king shined. Yet here Elvis stood, belt in hand, refusing to move on. "Mr. Presley," one guard whispered sharply, "we need to go." Another reached for his arm again, but Elvis gently pulled back. He wasn't in a rush. Not now. The voices of 20,000 fans leaped through the walls, booming chants of "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" The Hilton shook under their hunger for another song. The band stood ready, waiting for a signal. A return to stage could have sent the night into history, but Elvis's gaze stayed locked on Danny. A dangerous silence lingered. What if the crowd grew restless? What if they stormed the stage doors? What if the hotel executives, always worried about order and reputation, grew furious? This wasn't just compassion. It was risk. Danny lowered his head, whispering almost to himself, "Sir, you don't have to stop for me." But Elvis did. He moved one step closer, ignoring the tug of protocol. The spotlight didn't follow him here, but it didn't matter. A man who had lived under blinding lights for decades knew the value of stepping into the dark. The crew held their breath. The tension was electric, like static before lightning strikes. Some feared the delay, others felt something rare was about to happen, and Danny, his throat tightened, his chest burned. He wanted to shrink away, to vanish, but also to hold on to the moment forever. How often does the world's biggest star notice the smallest person in the room? Security's voices grew sharper. "Sir, please, crowd's getting loud." But Elvis didn't flinch. His choice was clear. The king of rock and roll would not be hurried. Not tonight. Because sometimes the greatest risk isn't on stage. It's daring to pause when everyone demands you keep moving. The chants rattled the Hilton showroom, a tidal wave of voices demanding an encore. Yet in the shadows, a quieter storm gathered. Elvis ignored the pull of the crowd, ignored the urgency in his guards' voices. He walked straight toward Danny Rivera. Danny's breath hitched. His legs nearly buckled as Elvis stood inches away. No spotlight lit this moment, no cameras flashed. It was just two men in the dark, one drenched in fame, the other in sweat. Then Elvis did something no one expected. He opened his arms and pulled Danny close. It wasn't a polite handshake, not a quick pat on the shoulder. It was a full embrace, firm and human. Danny froze, then collapsed into it. His shoulders trembled. Silent tears traced down his dirt-streaked face, staining the rhinestones on Elvis's jumpsuit. The room held its breath. Guards looked away, uncomfortable. Crew members paused, tools in hand, stunned by the sight. For years they had labored unseen, their work hidden under applause. Now, in one hug, the king had reminded them that they mattered. Elvis bent his head and whispered words that only Danny heard, words that would live forever in memory. Men like you keep me standing. Don't think I don't see it. 7 quiet words, yet they cut deeper than any roar of 20,000 fans. Danny gripped the fabric of Elvis's sleeve, unable to speak. He had worked countless nights, breaking his body for shows he could never afford to watch from the seats. And in one heartbeat, his life felt witnessed. The hug lasted only seconds, but time seemed to slow. Outside, the crowd thundered on, unaware. Inside, a truth unfolded. Even kings need shoulders to stand on, and even stagehands need to be reminded they exist. What would you have felt standing in Danny's shoes? Would you believe it, or think you were dreaming? Finally, Elvis let go, his hands lingering a moment longer on Danny's arms, steadying him like a brother. Danny wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed, but Elvis only smiled. Shock rippled quietly through the crew. One whispered, "Did that really just happen?" Another nodded slowly, tears pooling in her own eyes. And in that fragile silence, one truth rang louder than the encore outside. Greatness isn't measured by applause. It's measured by the hearts you lift when no one is watching. For a moment, the Hilton's backstage world stood still. The hug had cracked something open, something no one expected. Danny Rivera pulled back, still wiping his eyes, and the other crew members stared at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. It wasn't every day the king of rock and roll stopped the machine to honor a nameless stagehand. Yet here it was, real, raw, undeniable. One electrician, usually stone-faced, set down his wrench and began clapping softly. Another rolled over a chair for Danny, murmuring, "Sit down, man. You've earned it." Someone else pressed a towel into his hands. It was small, but it meant everything. A strange warmth spread through the crew. These were the people who lived in shadows, pulling ropes, rolling cables, fixing blown fuses while the audience only saw perfection. They were used to being invisible, but Elvis's choice flipped the script. Suddenly, every person backstage felt noticed, felt seen. Danny sat with the towel, his hands still shaking. He could hear the crowd chanting Elvis's name just beyond the walls, but for once, it didn't feel like the noise was drowning him out. Instead, he was part of the story. Elvis stood tall, watching the shift ripple through the team. A faint smile crossed his face. He had given them songs all night, but this was the gift that would last. One guard leaned close, whispering again, "We need to move, sir." But even then, Elvis didn't rush. He looked at the room full of stagehands, electricians, and runners, and nodded with a respect that words couldn't capture. What would it feel like, after years of labor in silence, to suddenly realize you mattered to the man everyone came to see? Could it change the way you carried yourself the next day? The Hilton's walls still trembled with applause, but backstage, another kind of music was playing, quieter, softer, made of gratitude and pride. Danny pressed the towel to his face, whispering under his breath, "Thank you." And in that moment, the invisible backbone of the show finally stepped into the light. The night ended, but the story did not. The encore chants eventually faded, the lights dimmed, and the Hilton showroom emptied. Fans carried their ticket stubs home like treasures, never knowing that the most unforgettable moment had happened out of sight. Yet whispers began to spread. A stagehand told a friend, a crew member mentioned it in a bar. One fan club newsletter in early 1977 carried a single line. Backstage, Elvis hugged a worker, said he kept him standing. It was small, almost hidden, but those who read it felt the weight. Danny Rivera himself wrote about it in his diary that night. His handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. Elvis saw me. Elvis thanked me. He underlined it twice. That battered notebook would remain in his family for decades, proof that even legends could stop for the unseen. Years later, a bootleg photograph surfaced, blurry, grainy, caught by a journalist sneaking through the curtains. It showed only the edge of the hug, Elvis's arm around a worker's back, Danny's head bowed. To some, it looked like nothing. To others, it was everything. The Hilton staff never forgot. In the early 1980s, after Elvis's passing, they quietly mounted a small plaque in the crew hallway. It read, "Dedicated to the unseen hands who held up the king." No fanfare, no press release, just a bronze reminder in a place only workers walked. By then, Danny was older, his back still aching from years of heavy labor. But whenever he passed that plaque, he paused. He touched the cool metal and remembered the weight of that hug, the words whispered in his ear. And the story spread again. Other stagehands told it to new recruits, almost like a legend passed in whispers. Elvis thanked one of us. In an industry built on fame and spotlight, it became a rare tale of humility, repeated backstage across venues, from Memphis to Los Angeles. What happens when kindness becomes folklore? Can a single gesture echo louder than 1,000 concerts? For Danny Rivera, the answer was yes. That moment became the anchor of his life, the proof that the grind was worth it. And for everyone who heard the story, it was a reminder that greatness doesn't just shine, it lifts. Las Vegas Hilton, November 14th, 1976. To most, it was just another concert in a long tour. Another night of flashing lights and ringing applause. But to one man in the shadows, it became the night that changed everything. Danny Rivera was never meant to be remembered. He was a stagehand, a name not printed on any ticket, not etched on any poster. Yet the king of rock and roll had seen him, had thanked him, had embraced him. That memory outlasted the songs, outlasted the stage, outlasted the man himself. And what does that tell us about greatness? It wasn't in the number of fans screaming outside, or the gold records that lined hotel walls. It wasn't even in the glittering jumpsuits, or the thunderous ovations. Greatness was in the quiet human moments, moments that no crowd ever saw, moments that carried no spotlight. The hug became a story, retold like a myth. Bootleggers whispered it. Crew members passed it down like a backstage prayer. A plaque still hangs in that hallway. The words simple but heavy. Dedicated to the unseen hands who held up the king. Visitors pass it without stopping, never knowing the tear-soaked truth behind it. But those who know, pause. Elvis Presley never lived to see how far the ripples would travel. But maybe that's the beauty of kindness. It doesn't ask for recognition. It doesn't demand applause. It simply plants itself in the soul of another person and grows. Danny's children would later tell the tale, pointing to that diary page, edges yellowed with age, the ink still smudged. They would say, "This is where Elvis told our father he mattered." For them, it was more than a memory. It was a legacy. Think about it. How many people have given everything in the shadows of someone else's spotlight? How many hands lift us higher, though no one ever knows their names? And what does it cost us to pause, to notice, to say, "I see you"? Elvis did not need to hug Danny Rivera. He could have walked past, followed protocol, and no one would have blamed him. But he chose differently. And in that small choice lived something larger than any encore could deliver. The king of rock and roll gave the world music. But on that night, he gave one man dignity. And maybe that is the truest mark of a legend. So when the spotlight turns your way, whether in a room of thousands or in the quiet corners of your life, ask yourself, will you remember the ones holding it steady for you? Because in the end, greatness is not what shines on stage. Greatness is who you lift in the dark. This story isn't just about Elvis. It's about every unseen hand that lifts others without recognition. If it moved you, Share it with someone who needs to be reminded their work matters. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been lifted by someone the world overlooked?